I looked into it, and this is, I think, the fifth time you've been on the show, like twice with a dedicated interview and two, maybe three times on a psychedelic cafe, which is great. You're the most repeated guest on Adventures of the Mind.
Wonderful. Well, I'm honored.
I guess with that, we'll jump right in if you're ready. Are you ready?
Yes. 1 second. I'm ready.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always guided by the underlying question of how we can work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, presently and across time, human and non-human alike. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Today's guest is Jerónimo Mazarrasa, someone who's been on the show a handful of times previously. He is program director at the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research, and Service, which is also called ICEERS. ICEERS is a nonprofit organization that is, quote, dedicated to transforming society's relationship with traditional indigenous medicines, end quote. Jerónimo is also founder of ICEERS Academy and creator of AyaSafety, an online course that seeks to help people increase the safety of their ayahuasca facilitation, in particular to non-traditional contexts. What non-traditional context means is going to be clear in the interview, as we're going to be talking about AyaSafety. We're going to talk about the course generally a little bit, but specifically we're going to be talking about a vignette from the AyaSafety course, which has to do with influence and suggestibility. It has to do with how a facilitator can accidentally harm their participants by unskillfully navigating the increased suggestibility that that participant will have as a consequence of ayahuasca and other psychedelics. Throughout the course of the interview, we're going to talk about a couple of specific ways, sort of specific scenarios where the increased suggestibility and influence potential between facilitator and client can accidentally harm client or participant, by using examples of where those scenarios were handled well and where they were handled not so well. We also talk about the relationship between openness and vulnerability, around how caring and a lack of care can exist simultaneously, how isolation and the clandestine nature of underground psychedelic facilitation can block cultural learning, how a facilitator can learn what is harmful to their clients with respect to suggestibility, but also how participants can protect themselves from the harm of a facilitator's lack of care. So that's a sort of general list, maybe, of the things, the topics we're going to discuss today on the show between Jerónimo and myself. And as always, there are going to be chapters available if you want to just jump ahead to a specific section, be they timestamps in the description or embedded directly in the file if you're listening to this on like Overcast or something, or watching it on YouTube. So if there's a specific part of this you want to jump to, it's all going to be listed there. So feel free to jump ahead. Although, I think listening to the whole interview is worthwhile. I really do genuinely believe Jerónimo has a lot of great things to offer in this episode and generally. Now, before we get into the interview, which we're going to do very shortly, there are two things I want to say about the AyaSafety course. The first thing is that it starts on May 9th. Registration closes May 5th. If you use the promo code AyaTTM, so that's Ayahuasca Adventures Through the Mind, AyaTTM, you can get 15% off the price of the course. If you use that promo code before March 23rd, it gets added on top of the early bird price for 25% off the price of the course, which I think is great. So again, AyaTTM to get at least 15% off the price of the course, if not 25% if you do so relatively soon. Links to check out the course and assess it for yourself will be in the description to this episode. The second thing I want to say about the course is that I took it back in 2023, not as a facilitator because I don't, but as somebody who does do some integration coaching and also I try to position myself in such a way in the sort of cultural movements and learnings around psychedelics that I can, I guess, share that learning through the avenue of the podcast and through integration coaching so that I can have a positive effect on this kind of movement that we're all a part of simply by listening right now. You are a part of this. And so I took the course, and I mean, to the best of my authority to say so, I think objectively it's a very good course, but personally I found it incredibly valuable and incredibly insightful. So that's the second thing I want to say, is that I genuinely believe this is a course that if you are a facilitator, are becoming a facilitator, or want to become a facilitator of ayahuasca or any other psychedelic, this course will be invaluable to you and to your clients. And so I highly encourage you to at least head over to the link, take a look, and assess whether or not it's right for you, because I do genuinely believe that Jerónimo and the ICEERS team have put together something really, really beneficial here with this course. And that's all for the intro, a very long intro today. Thank you for bearing with me. And without any further ado, here is my interview with Jerónimo Mazarrasa on episode 195 of Adventures Through the Mind. Enjoy. Jerónimo Mazarrasa, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind again for your fifth, maybe sixth time.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be here again.
So the last time you were on the show, it was pertaining to what you're doing, like a course that you run with ICEERS, which is the AyaSafety Course. There's a longer title, which I'll get you to say in a moment. And you had approached me saying like, hey, can we do an interview and like talk about some of the content of this course? And knowing you, trusting your work and trusting ICEERS, I was like, sure, let's do it, even though I had really no in-depth understanding of what the course was about. And I thought it was a great interview. We specifically explored what in the course you talk about as the 6 pitfalls for ayahuasca facilitators: sex, money, power, legal issues, intercultural relationships, and what's the 6th one?
It's isolation.
Isolation, of course. And well, since then I've actually taken the course. And so where before I just sort of like trusted in you and ICEERS, now I can confidently say like, yes, this is a hell of a good course. And it's nice to have you back on the show to talk about it. This interview, we're going to go specifically into one area of the course, which has to do with suggestibility and influence and how that relates to vulnerabilities and potential harms that can come from this in the mix with ayahuasca. But before we get there, why don't you just give us a quick kind of like the elevator pitch of what this course is, who it's for, and when it starts?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this course basically comes out of, I've been drinking ayahuasca for 20 years. I worked in a number of documentaries. Then I've been working with ICEERS for more than 10. And in this process, I've spent a lot of time with, dozens, more like hundreds of facilitators, people working with plants. In different, different types of relationships. At first, I was making films about some of them. Then I was, working directly with them through my work with ICEERS. But one thing that I noticed was that basically, and this has to do with the trap of isolation, because very often, because of the nature of the work of ayahuasca, and also because very often people working with plants are working in some sort of clandestinity or semi-clandestinity. There is a process that happens naturally with just about everything in our society when you throw something new at our societies, is that, there's a few years where, a lot of mistakes get made. And then people very quickly begin to figure out how this works, and then it evolves very quickly. So, I always use examples like if you look at, surfers 60 years ago and what they're doing now, or you look at, latte art and the drawings that people make generally speaking, our societies receive new things And there's a period where it's most dangerous. You can also see it with X-rays, for example. When X-rays were first invented, everybody was really excited that you could look inside of people, and then they were running X-rays all the time on pregnant women. They would put people on X-rays for hours just to see how digestion worked, etc., etc. And it took some time to realize that X-rays are indeed a wonderful tool, but they have some dangers and some risks, and that they have to manage with certain safety. And this process happens sort of naturally and organically, but it hasn't happened with psychedelics. If you look at the way we use LSD now, you cannot say that it's significantly better than the way it was used in the 1960s.
And when you say that, you mean it hasn't happened with psychedelics in sort of the modern Western global North world?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Because indeed, when you look at traditional use of psychedelics, you see the opposite. You see indeed very, very evolved, sophisticated systems where very much, the benefits are maximized and the harms are minimized. So the reason I think why it hasn't happened is because when things are in clandestinity, when things are even sometimes outright illegal, then it's very difficult for this very natural flow of information to sort of circulate. And then people tend to sort of encapsulate themselves in these sort of like bubbles, where certain groups develop certain techniques and other groups develop other techniques, but they're not really talking to each other, and so the level of it doesn't raise, but sort of stays kind of stagnant in a way. So the sort of a motivation behind the course, not just the course, but a lot of the work that I do in ICERS has to do with sort of pollinating, with gathering all of these sort of practical, empirical knowledge that has been developed both by indigenous and traditional cultures and by sort of westernized uses of these psychedelics, and putting it all together in one place, one resource, one course, where we can address one very particular topic that is not very often addressed directly, which is just safety. So the course is called AyaSafety because it's only about safety. It's about increasing the safety of ceremonial plant work in what we call non-native contexts. Non-native context means when you take, so if an indigenous shaman is doing an ayahuasca ceremony in their community, that's a native context. When that same shaman is working outside of the community in an urban environment in that country or in other countries, then it's no longer a native context, even if the entire ritual itself is still fully traditional. And then so in non-native contexts, they bring a whole set of new needs and new situations that are not necessarily present in native contexts. Most often native contexts are community contexts. And that means that what we call screening and what we would call integration happens sort of implicitly.
In the native context.
Yes, yeah. People know each other. So you don't need to have a previous interview to screen whatever. And if someone after drinking ayahuasca is not doing well, people are going to know. You don't need to do a protocol follow-up because this just comes through the grapevine. So in this course, it's a course aimed for people who are interested in increasing the safety of ceremonies. This includes everybody from, assistants, participants, organizers. Sometimes we get people who are simply interested, they're just participants. And we focus only on safety issues. So physical safety, psychological safety, and legal safety. The parts that we don't touch are the parts that are usually most important and most relevant in facilitators' work, such as, ritual, energetic, spiritual aspects of the work. We don't enter at all on this. This is not a course to learn how to run ceremonies. This is a course for people that are already involved in running ceremonies, who want to improve the level of safety of the work that they offer. So it's very, in that sense, it's very, very different from what's out there and what is usually associated. Not normally people who are learning some sort of facilitator or psychedelic assisted therapy, safety is a small part of a much bigger thing that has to do with how the ceremonies are run or, the sessions, etc. This is not it. This is only about the safety.
And to clarify, I think listeners would be able to infer it, but I didn't hear you say it specifically. You talked about native facilitators or shamans in their native context. When they leave that context, it's non-native. You didn't speak to people who are not native.
Of course.
People, right? You like anyone who gets the, starts practicing the facilitation of ayahuasca, who isn't someone who was born into and raised within a native context of ayahuasca use, such as in the indigenous communities that have used it for at least hundreds, if not thousands of years. That's what you're, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That, that we don't have, this is not course aimed or directed at indigenous people. They know well enough how to manage the work that they do. But people who have learned from indigenous people might be interested and might learn some interesting things in this course, some valuable things for them, and all the way to people who are working with plant medicines who don't have an indigenous or traditional training but have developed other ways. They will also find some value in this. We also have people that are, for example, people who organize tours of people who work with plants. Also sometimes join the course. They don't directly work with the plants, but they are in the organization of these ceremonies, and then they will also benefit from this knowledge. And we also have psychologists participate, all sorts of people interested in the topic.
I mean, myself as well. Like, primarily, my role is journalistic, on a research level. But to the degree of my direct involvement is usually with people, supporting them in their integration and so forth. And even for myself, I found like I got a lot out of the course. When does this iteration, it runs every year, but when does this iteration of the course start? And give me like a basic layout, like how often for how long, and then we'll sort of like cap that off, and then we'll go specifically into suggestibility, which I'll have a question to prompt there.
Yeah, the course happens every year. It's a little bit shorter than 5 months. So the course starts in May and it runs all the way to October, November. And there's about 1 hour of videos a week. And then every two weeks, there's a live meeting where people can ask questions and we can have debates, and there's guest guest opponents, etc., from the different teachers and people who teach in the course. And then application for the course is open, excuse me, already, and it will run until the end of April.
Awesome. I'll make sure links to all of that are in the show notes of this episode or on wherever people are checking it out. And I'll ask you again for those details at the end. So let's get specifically into what I want to explore here with you today, which has to do with, which is from, Module 5, which I believe was called Psychology for Non-Psychologists. One of the cool things about the course is that you have this way of skillfully using repetition to help sort of ingrain things in sort of different contexts of discussion, as well as at like different sort of depths, perhaps. So it's mentioned previously throughout the course, but I believe it's in Psychology for Non-Psychologists that you go a little bit deeper. Let's start off by hearing, what is suggestibility or influence? And what is it about ayahuasca that makes this something worthy of considering as a potential concern?
Yeah, I mean, I would start by saying that, psychedelics, not just ayahuasca, tend to open people up and they tend to make them more suggestible. This is not a bug. This is a feature. This is part of the reason why people take psychedelics. So this is the first thing to understand. It's not wrong in and of itself. Is the very source of the power of these substances. So what makes cars useful is that they can go very fast. This also makes them somewhat unsafe. We could make safer cars that only run 40 kilometers an hour. But most people wouldn't be interested because, they want cars to be able to go a little bit faster from one place to the other. And they're willing to assume the risk that comes with the fact that if you're going at 100 kilometers an hour, there is more harm that might come to you than if you were running at 40. So first, I want to establish this. There's nothing, it's sort of one that if psychedelics were, the level of suggestibility in psychedelics were lower, it would also lower their power and their capacity to help. So that's, first of all, suggestibility is not in and of itself, or openness that comes from psychedelics is not in and of itself a negative trait. Usually it's quite the opposite. However, it comes with a certain, much like speeding cars, it comes with certain added dangers precisely because there's more openness and suggestibility. So, you know, when people take psychedelics, they might have some of the most, you know, powerful, profound experiences of their lives. When that happens, the person is, you know, shocked, in awe, is very grateful, is very moved, and is deeply shaken. And this applies not just to the duration of the effect of the psychedelic, but there's a quite a sort of tail or afterglow of this. You could say that it lasts, I would say, even a few weeks, where the person can be still deeply sort of, you know, affected by what happened. Again, this is not a bug. This is a feature. This is precisely the point. This is why, you know, it's looking for this experience that people approach psychedelics very often, and it's the root of their therapeutic value. But because the people have become so open and so suggestible, and because this period of sort of suggestibility is larger than just the effects, just the duration of the fact, a whole new set of sort of safety features come, which is, I think here, you know, perhaps the metaphor is not so much safety as it could be hygiene. Hygiene might be a better way to think about it. When you are about to undergo surgery, your body is going to be open up, you know, things will be taken in and out of your body, and, you know, a part of yourself that is normally not exposed to the elements is going to be exposed to the elements. In these conditions, hygiene is extremely important. The tools, the operation, the surgery room, the hands of everybody have to be extremely sanitized. You know, hygiene is called asepsis. You know, you want to make sure that when you close the person back up, nothing from the outside got in that could be harmful. Now, it's a useful metaphor to think about what happens to people on psychedelics, except it's not their internal physical bodies, but it's their psyche, it's our internal sort of world, and our psyche and our psychology, which actually gets exposed to levels that normally are not exposed to the outside world, even to ourselves. And in here, the asepsis, the hygiene, doesn't have to do with, you know, how physically clean of germs the environment is, but with the work, the attitudes, and the position of the facilitator, which is the person, because it's the closest person, who can be most likely to sort of introduce, willingly or unwillingly, you know, with the best intentions or with ignorance or directly with bad intentions, can, you know, really affect a person in a period where they're very open.
And so the aspect of the core, I've got a list of ways in which facilitators can, you know, accidentally harm their clients with specific respect to suggestibility. It's a longer list in the course, but this is the ones that are most directly about suggestibility. And part of the sort of setup for the list is to discuss like vulnerabilities. Is this openness that you're talking about? When we are open, like our surgery or whatever, we're quite vulnerable in that space. And the surgeons, the hospital staff, all the rest, that hygiene, part of that hygiene is them caring for our vulnerabilities such that, you know, as we open ourselves up to be vulnerable, what is offered to us is something that can help us be healthier afterwards, or fix the problem that the surgery was about, or whatever it might be, rather than introducing these other things in the state of vulnerability. Is that about right?
I would say, yeah. I mean, vulnerability would be like the negative reading of openness, right? They're the same phenomenon, you know, and you can see these in other, you know, sort of life processes that touch people very deep. For example, falling in love. People who are in love are also very open. And this brings with it a wonderful flow of emotions and feelings and things, but they're also extremely vulnerable, so that, the person that is the object of their love, if they can, they can do a tiny thing, and really send them reeling. So in the case of the work with psychedelics, what happens is, first of all, again, this is not a bug but a feature. All of us have a certain worldview, a way that we interpret things, an ideology. You can call it an ideology about politics, an ideology about relationships, an ideology about sexuality, an ideology about, all of us have this. This is unavoidable. You don't have a person that is neutral, right? This is inevitable. But in the case of psychedelic work, if the facilitator is not able to sort of keep this inner ideology, which is also the compass of the facilitator, is what the facilitator uses to decide what to do, what not to do. I mean, this is not an attack on ideology, although there are certain toxic ideologies, but it's not ideology itself that is the problem. The problem is that when facilitators don't learn how to keep this to themselves and make very clear boundaries of where their interpretations begin and the experience of the boundary between their interpretation and the experience of the facilitator. The problem sometimes becomes when facilitators, whether, most often with the best intentions in the world, begin to give this ideology back to the participant, begin to give certain interpretations back to the participant, and begin to guide the participant's understanding of what's happened or not. I mean, I will give a very sort of clear example because I think it's easier.
Let's take a pause. Let's take a pause there. I want this clear example, but I also want to ask you a little bit. I want to go through this list of ways that this could happen.
I'm going to give the short answer.
All right,
I will give the short answer, and then we can go to the list of ways. So to make it very short or very succinct, the most important thing that a guide can know about one of their participants' experience is not what it actually means or what is the right answer or the right thing to tell this person about what they lived, because this is very hard to do in many cases. And psychedelic experiences are not always crystal clear in their meaning or in their interpretation. What's very, very important, we cannot expect guides to know what the right answer is in every step, but guides should definitely know which ones are the problematic interpretations that can harm the person and avoid these. That's the asepsis. That's the hygiene. The hygiene is not to bring certain things, knowing which things, and also not just interpretations in themselves, but interpretations in the participant. So, for example, the participant will decide to make a drastic life change, and the facilitator will openly or less openly encourage this, instead of telling the participant, look, you should be careful. You had a very strong experience. This happens all the time. We have seen this gone very wrong. Sometimes this has gone very right. Our advice would be that, you take it easy and we go slowly. Don't worry. You don't need to make this big change. So this is an example. This would be an example of that.
So I want to go more deeply into the complexities. I think I like the way you characterize that there. It's not so much knowing what the right thing to offer is. It's being aware of what the, quote unquote, wrong things to offer or allow are. And I want to go into that a little bit more in a bit. First, I want to go through this list. So this list of ways in which the facilitator can accidentally, harm their clients through suggestibility. I'll list each one, some of which I think is going to come with a bit of repetition, but I think that will be helpful in integrating the understanding. So the first one I have is imposing their own beliefs onto a vulnerable individual, for example, homosexuality.
Yeah, I mean, I have a true story about that. Where this that I heard from a facilitator. And he said, once this woman came to drink ayahuasca with me, and she cried all night. And then when in the next morning, she told me that she was crying all night because ayahuasca told her that she was a lesbian. And she was not a lesbian. Is she? As she asked the facilitator. And the facilitator told her, look, you're not a lesbian. You're just afraid of being a lesbian. That is like a terrible psychological knot, right? To put somebody into. Because if they do have homosexual, then this will make them believe that actually is fear, but not their actually drives. And if they don't have it, they will believe that it's an answer that is wrong no matter how you look at it. The right answer for this would be like something like, well, this process about identity and sexuality are very delicate. These things happen sometimes in the ayahuasca, and I know a person that you could talk to that can help guide you better through this turmoil, or through this, this is when it comes to people's identities, even your best, intuition can actually throw things off balance.
And when you say, I know someone who can help you through this, you're talking about someone that a facilitator ideally would have in their sort of like either direct or sort of, satellite team that might be a therapist or someone specifically who deals with gender identity or sexual identity, someone that is their skill set. And so it's like you refer out to people who it is their skill set.
That's what we recommend in the course. We recommend that facilitators are very aware of the limits of their knowledge, which is very wide, but is very focused on usually what happens during the session. And that they don't overstep the boundaries of their own knowledge. I will give you a counterexample, which is, I think, a good example. This was from another facilitator. They got hired to do one-to-one sessions with this woman, and she was the wife of a very well-to-do man. And they will begin to do this, and through the sessions, the woman begin to open up and begin to touch certain aspects of her life and her past and their current circumstances, as is often happened. And she began to share them with the facilitator. And then she began to ask him for advice on a number of sort of important life decisions that she had to make. And that's when he said, look, this is the limit of what I can do. I can share the ayahuasca with you and I can take care of you during the ceremony, and I can talk to you afterwards. But in terms of this, very difficult sort of decisions and things that you have to look into, this is outside of my, of my knowledge. And you should actually talk to a therapist, someone who's like, skilled in guiding people through things like this. I'm not the person to help you make these decisions.
So, I mean, knowing your limitations infers being able to know yourself, which I understand to be a part of the course that you go into. But maybe that'll come up again, maybe not. But let's move on to the next question or the next list of the next point. Inappropriate introduction to religious or spiritual beliefs while under the influence or shortly afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, these things, I cannot stress enough how important, and without picking for many people working with plants, this sort of like a spiritual sort of, basis is. They couldn't do the work they do without this. And it absolutely sort of, shapes and informs how they work. The question is, does their participants need to receive this, or this is just, for you? I will give you what I think is a very good example. It actually comes from an indigenous Colombian, Taita. And he told me the following: as you know, for people in the indigenous world, the spiritual realm is very much real. It's not a psychological issue. It's actually very much sort of a real. So he says, often I get Western people that come to me and they carry with them this sort of, you can call them dark energies, dark spirits, dark entities, parasitic. It takes many names, but they come with this, When they come to me with this, I just clean them off it. but I don't tell them anything. Because I have noticed that when you tell white people these things, white people, they don't understand this world. And it only scares them. And it drives them into this sort of paranoia, like suddenly they have encountered. So you see, there is a way for facilitators to keep very much in line with their worldview and do their work based on their worldview, and still not impose on the others a worldview that it can be deeply foreign to them and can cause all sorts of sort of like ontological shock, which is something that also happens sometimes around ayahuasca and other psychedelics, that people go very quickly from a sort of materialistic world to a much more spiritual world of which they understand very little or nothing at all. And then, well, it's like being, it's like suddenly being dropped in the middle of the jungle. You're just in a completely foreign environment and you don't know what's good, what's bad, what can be had, what cannot be had, what water can be drunk and not drunk, where is the danger, and you just become, deeply vulnerable and scared.
Again, this is something that's going to come up a little bit more later, because this kind of like, the vulnerability, the disorientation sort of like calls in a question, especially when it pertains to sort of understanding the ontology, the sort of spiritual awakening that can come through ayahuasca, and the role the facilitator does or doesn't have in supporting that part of it, which is directly a part in some ways of the work. But we're going to talk about that in a second. The next thing I have on the list here is sharing with the client or participant that you had some kind of vision or telepathic understanding of something about their experience, their history, their lineage, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this is not just common to I would say to ayahuasca, but in general to any sort of once I went, I myself have a sort of ambivalent relationship to things like tarot readings, the horoscope, and etc. But I'm still a consumer of these things. I find it useful, even though I'm not sure if I fully believe it. But I'm still a consumer. So one time I went and I had my astral chart, and I got a card reading. I was in a difficult moment of my life, and I figured any might be interesting enough. And this was a very special. It was a woman. It was a very, very sort of special character. It has absolutely nothing to do with psychedelics. But what I understood in the conversation that I had with this person is that the skill set that she possessed, what she had learned all of these years, was not how to interpret what the cards said or what the horoscope said, but how to take that interpretation and turn it into a message that was helpful to the person that was going to receive it. And there's a huge difference between these two things. And I can give you examples of the opposite. I can give you examples of people I know who went to a tarot reader, and the tarot reader told them that her husband was cheating on them with a woman in a foreign country, that blah, blah, blah. And this was not true. It was not true. And that reader caused humongous harm to this person and this person's marriage. And go figure what she saw in the cards. But for sure, the delivery of that information was incorrect and was harmful. So there's a skill set that has to do with how do you deliver certain intuitions, readings, call it what you will. It doesn't have to be spiritual to work anyway. We all the time have certain notions or ideas, right? But how those get turned into a message that will, help people as opposed to harm them. This is the actual skill that takes years to learn. Not the skill of having the intuitions or reading the cards or knowing what the symbology means.
And this applies for, even if, during an ayahuasca ceremony as the facilitator, you have some sort of insight about what must have happened to their great grandmother, or something about their paternal line, or a past life, or something that it can pose harm to the individual, the participant, the client, as a facilitator, to share that with them as though it was like, ultimately to share it with them in a way that could constrain their understanding of themselves and their experience.
I mean, the thing is, again, and I go back to the story of the Taita. Like, as a facilitator, how much do you need to tell the person in order for your work to be successful? I think that the example of the Taita is, it's a brilliant example of sort of ethical work. He definitely saw things in the people that came to him, and he was definitely acting upon these things. But to which degree was it necessary that he shared this information with the participants, and how sure was he that this information was going to be helpful instead of harmful? And so this is just no longer a question of whether it's true, right? And this is again what I get is like this sort of skill set has to do with a very fine understanding of these things. And this doesn't have to do with it's a very fine understanding of where these things can become far harmful. Other times, these things are indeed very helpful, right? So, we will see again and again, and, I think you will remember from a course that, we get asked lots of questions, and very often the answer is, it depends. There's no, one size fits all, cookie cutter, perfect solution for everything. No, the same thing can be helpful or harmful depending on the circumstances. And one cannot make these sort of clear cuts. And the ability to discern this is indeed the sort of the art of the work of of what facilitators learn. It's not how to measure the dose and distribute this and sing some songs, but which also is part of the work. But it's this thing, it's again, there's one part that is technical, like I saw with the card reader about laying the cards and knowing what each card means. And there's one part that is sort of like experiential and that is learned. And is that now, how does this information that you receive be put to best use to help the person instead of to harm them?
So the next list, I've got, 3, perhaps 4 of this list before I get into the sort of like coming back into what you're talking about here and the balance between like this sort of like experiential skill set. Claiming that perception or suggestions come from an external source, for example, God or the plant, and not from the guide themselves.
And again, sometimes, right? Again, this is not, I would, there's been all sorts of, examples of perceptions and suggestions that seem to come from external sources and that have had, very sort of valuable impact on people's lives and beneficial effect. But also external. The problem comes when you basically relinquish the responsibility. So you drink ayahuasca and ayahuasca tells you to divorce your wife. When should you divorce your wife? Well, I think, just as a sort of advice, you should divorce your wife when you can tell your wife, look, I thought about it and I realized that I want a divorce. So when you can take ayahuasca out of the picture, the worst thing you can do is go to your wife and say, ayahuasca told me I should get divorced, so I'm going to get divorced. That is, claiming a perception and putting on an outside source, and putting all the responsibility on the outside source. And then you keep your sort of innocence because you're not responsible. It's just something that ayahuasca told me, which is a superior force. And no, this doesn't work like this. This is still a decision that you're making that is affecting your wife, your children, all sorts of, your lifestyle. And you should take this decision personally as a personal responsibility, not as a command from an outside force. Not because, again, ayahuasca doesn't tell you or these things cannot be true or that you shouldn't divorce your wife. Sometimes you should. But whether you should or not, it should be 100% your agency, and your responsibility in making this decision and you take the things that come from ayahuasca, from the external source, whatever it is, as a sort of a lamp to help you shed light on some parts that are not visible to you or that are, it becomes one more perspective that helps you enrich your perspectives and make an informed decision as an autonomous, sovereign individual, which is something that you should never lose. This also comes, from the traditions. I've often, heard from, from indigenous shamans, this sort of concept that you cannot let yourself be, that you always have to remain in mastery, in ownership of your thought and of your being. I got this advice a number of times when I was sort of undergoing this sort of like, sort of shape shifting and transformation into different animals, which was, very intoxicating experience for me, And the advice that I got is, well, like, that's great that you got to feel, the power of this creature, but you should always remember that you're a human being and you're not this animal, and that you should always remain, ownership of this, and then ride this experience like this, right? And it goes back to a similar sort of, ayahuasca is going, and other psychedelics is going to expose you all sorts of things that are inside of you and outside of you. And some of them are absolutely fantastic and life-changing, and they will enrich your life. And some of them are sort of debris and hubris of your own that also get amplified. Your sadness, your jealousy can sometimes get, very much amplified with ayahuasca. Your paranoia that is like sort of like in the background can get very much amplified with ayahuasca. And this is a way of, understanding that this is part of you. But if you let yourself be carried away by it and convinced that this is sort of a deeper truth than the deepest truth, that is that you remain a sovereign individual, and that you remain responsible for the choices that you make, that's when things go off the rails.
And I mean, you spoke specifically to sort of a participant having an experience. We talked about this in our last interview. Ayahuasca told me that. It's like the sort of the description or the phrase that you used to describe this kind of phenomenon. And you're talking specifically to, someone gets an experience of ayahuasca telling them something, and then about this, maintaining this agency and the sort of potential harms of letting that external source sort of dictate or to act from the sort of perceived dictation from external source. You also kind of like referenced a moment where, a facilitator for you sort of did the sort of the helpful thing, which is to sort of encourage you back towards your center rather than affirming like, yes, that's because you are the jaguar or you are the anaconda. So one of the potential harms under the suggestibility here would be for a facilitator to affirm to their participant, yes, in fact, ayahuasca did tell you that, and to either explicitly or implicitly infer that has a kind of authority that needs to be trusted, followed, acted upon, etc. Is there any, like, please feel free to, expand or correct that. And then maybe if there's anything else with respect to this external source as it pertains to the facilitator that you'd like to speak on.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it all depends. Some people have these encounters with these animals, with the jaguars and the anacondas, and they're deeply meaningful and life-changing, and they inform big changes. They're a big part, for example, of shamanic awakenings. But in my case, I don't facilitate. I'm not a facilitator. I had a fantastic possibility to tap into something, but that was it. So the experience is not exclusive. Having this experience doesn't mean that. Because, becoming a facilitator is a certain calling, is a certain also a skill set. I sometimes, use the example of, it's the difference between going to art school and being an artist. Everybody understands that artists are people that have a certain talent and they seem to be born with this. It's a certain facility, a certain affinity to make music, to draw, to whatever. And you can see it very, very early on. Now, having this affinity is not the same thing as being an accomplished artist. That takes years of work and honing this ability. And many, many years of work and practice is what takes you to be a great artist. You need the talent and you need the work. And then, you can go to school. And you can go to school even if you don't have this talent. And you will still learn some things, and that will not make you. So all of these things are what combines in these things, So very often people have, the experience of, of healing in themselves, of healing in others, and this is a talent that is, democratically widespread, like the talent of making music or the talent of, but having a talent and even getting a taste of this thing is not at all the same thing as doing all the work to become a skilled professional. So this is what, and this is where, many people can get, the jaguars and the anacondas, and only very few of them will become, accomplished, walkers on this path.
I'm wondering if there's still a piece there around how a facilitator then speaks to their client with respect to these experiences when they arise. But I think that is well inferred, I think, so far with the way that go ahead.
I think always with just basically explaining these realities. Well, this is a very long path. Sometimes it means something, sometimes it doesn't, Not everybody gets this experience, but then again, it's not unique to have this experience. And it's something that would get, again, I think, part of the wonder of engaging, at least for me, with ayahuasca, has been the sort of the very slow process. I've been drinking now 20 years, in which things are, revealed. They're revealed fairly quickly, and they're only understood much, much later. And the process by which I am still elaborating, and understanding things that happened to me 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, and still now only beginning to sort of capture, and I was lucky enough to be with, facilitators who basically just sort of told me things like, well, the content that emerges in ayahuasca ceremonies it doesn't come with a timestamp. So it's never possible to know whether you're getting a vision about your present, about your future, about yourself, or about the world at large, or all of the above. All of these only get settled with time. Only time will let you understand, what was the meaning of what you lived. This is the sort of I think better practice around these things.
Okay, let's take a little break from the interview here, as I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon. This podcast and its sort of place in my sort of work, my larger work in the world, it feels like, at least as a writer and a researcher, it's deeply meaningful to me. It's also my job. It's my full-time job. Without the support of my patrons, I would not be able to earn a living while doing this thing that is both my calling and my job. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that. So thank you. The people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode are at the $23 plus tier. So extra thanks to them for that significant contribution to the hard and soft expenses of the show. If you listening now are not a patron and you're finding value in the show, I ask you to please become a patron by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. You can sign up there for as little as a couple of dollars if you like. More would be better, of course, but every little bit is something, and it all adds into me earning an income, earning a living on this thing that I put my hours and money towards making for you. If you aren't in a place where you can contribute monthly, you'd like to just toss me a tip for a job well done on this episode. If you think it is well done, you can do so through PayPal or cryptocurrencies. Links to both of these are in the description to this episode wherever you're checking it out. And if you are not in a place to contribute financially in any way, well, don't worry about it. Enjoy, appreciate those who can contribute financially do, so that all of us get to enjoy Adventures Through the Mind together. And so thank you in advance for contributing to the hard and soft expenses of producing this show. Now let's get back into the interview with Jerónimo. So let's go to the next point. And I suppose I'll read it the way it's written down, but I imagine it's something that you could hear from both the client and the guide's perspective, as if it was being said to the guide or to the client. So the point is this. ignoring how a guide's perspective, beliefs, and language influences the client's experience. For example, UFOs, Jung, as in Carl Jung, death, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this is, this is, for example, we are now in a process in which certain ideology, or you can call it psychological theories around trauma, are very, very widespread. And this theory, and I'm making a very sort of short a summary of it, says something like, something bad happened to you when you were a kid. You don't remember this bad thing, but this bad thing is still conditioning everything that happens in your life. And until you get to this thing and you uncover this trauma, this traumatic event, you're not going to be able to go forward no matter what you do, because this thing is there getting in the way. This is, of course, based on, sort of true observation, of a number of cases where people who undergone, very, very bad things, and they went into some sort of dissociative state, and then they didn't remember for a long time what happened. And then and then later on, this was revealed. The problem is when you work this theory backwards and you say, because this thing happened to these people, we must all carry this, and everybody has to go look for this thing that they forgot in their past. And then you begin looking for something, right? Then you are, in a way, sort of creating a situation that, once you begin to look for something, then of course you're going to find something. And sometimes you're going to find something that is true, and sometimes you're just going to get a reflection of your belief, which is also something that ayahuasca does. It puts your beliefs in front of you, but it doesn't tell you this is your belief. It just shows you an image, right? So another place where these things get, so I've seen, certain, less skilled facilitators who were more obsessed with trauma thing, basically, in a way, condition people. So ask them questions, like, what is the most traumatic thing that happened to you? What is the worst thing that happened to you? Talk to me about, and begin to sort of bring up a number of questions that already create an environment, create an idea, create a sort of predisposition, what in trials, the lawyers will call leading questions. This is a leading question, right? How fast were you going when you slammed into the other car? Well, maybe they didn't slam, maybe they just bumped, right? In that sentence, you're already putting your leading in, right? So that's an example, of something that has to be managed. It's one thing for people to remember something, and it's another thing for you to tell them that they have to remember something, or there's probably something that they have to remember.
And so this can be, so what you're saying is, like, there's the level in which it's kind of imposed directly, say with these leading questions. But if I'm interpreting this right or correctly, there's also just, if I'm a facilitator, how I talk about the experience, how I talk about, say, the mushroom experience or ayahuasca, how I refer to ayahuasca, what it does for me. If I start talking a lot about it helps to heal trauma, and I start sort of having a perspective on what ayahuasca does and what it does to, what configuration or organization of the human psyche and, my frame of this ontology and these beliefs, and use language that sort of captures that, I'm kind of imposing, or at least I'm at least offering, but I might be imposing a priming onto a client's experience that would alter their experience, or maybe either support them, like you said, it depends, or harm them. Is that kind of what you're speaking to?
That's the thing. There's an aspect to this same phenomenon that is invaluable, right? And I'm thinking of, some of the most beautiful songs that I've heard in ayahuasca ceremonies that spoke about the most lofty feelings and the opening of the heart and the connection and Mother Nature. And I mean, I'm sure you've been there. You want to cry so beautifully, so inspiring, and it takes you to such places, right? And this is also influence, right? And this is also suggestibility, and this is also vulnerability, but it's used in a very particular direction, right? It is used to sort of evoke and bring out of people the best things in them, So, I mean, I've had songs, certain incurs that I've heard, absolutely blow my mind with the words that were being used. But these were, extremely carefully chosen words, about forgiveness, about that. This is also influence. That's what I mean. That this is not a bug. It's a feature, right? This is, and a big part of the work of the certainly traditional healers of curanderos is precisely to blur the boundaries between your experience and their work. The question is the hygiene. There's nothing, yes, when you are going to do surgery, you're going to cut people open. This is, people are going to be exposed. This is yes, you need to. So I'm not trying to, say this is something bad that should be taken away, because no, this is the very core of the work. And what I'm saying is that this level of work requires a level of hygiene and of care that is sometimes not present. And that most of these, revolves around the type of self-knowledge that the facilitator has, right? It's like, until you know very well who you are, what are your drives, what are your desires, what are your fears, what are your sort of driving instincts, it's very, very difficult to be able to discern and to separate what comes from you, what comes from the other person, and what comes from the experience. This is the reason, I believe, why, traditionally training for people who work with psychedelics is very, very long. And it's very, very long and is supervised by someone for many, many years. It's a sort of apprenticeship, because it requires that the person undergoes a personal process of self-inquiry. And this process has to be supervised closely by somebody else, because we by ourselves cannot see our blind spots.
And this speaks to, the pitfall at the beginning of the interview. We talked about the 6 pitfalls from the previous interview, also part of the course, and the one that I forgot, which is interesting. I'm going to put a level of extra interpretation here. The one that I forgot was isolation, but thankfully I didn't forget it in isolation. You were there to reflect it back to me, to help me remember, yes, to see what I could not see in myself. And so what I'm hearing is that, yeah, again, isolation can be something kind of like funnels facilitators into not being able to see themselves, to know themselves, in order to not harm their clients with the lack of self-knowledge that leads them to perhaps perpetuating unhygienic engagement with during and after ceremonies.
Yeah, proper discernment. So this is again something that is much more rare in traditional communities, because people are not isolated in the same way. So what happens around usually sort of, for example, plant medicine circles, is that you end up having this structure that is sort of a pyramid. There's a person on top that is the most knowledgeable. There's a group of people that work with this person. And then there's a group of people who drink with this person. So the person who is on top, the very knowledgeable person, is not alone at all. They're constantly surrounded by people. Where in the place where they're alone is they're alone in peers. They have nobody who is at their level who can call them on their. This doesn't happen in indigenous communities. In indigenous communities, whether it's your wife, your father, your brother, your sister, your father, somebody's gonna call you up on this, right? If you begin to get somebody who's known you all their life and say, hey, look, I know you since you were a kid, and you're going off the rails. This is much harder in this sort of, isolated, atomized sort of bubble situation that tends to happen around sort of clandestine, plant medicine and psychedelic practices. And this is the last danger for facilitators, because it's the danger that comes the latest. It usually comes late in the life of facilitators, when all the other things have been sorted. The person has a solid sort of team and operation has been running for years. They're very experienced. They're confident in themselves. They're confident in their work, and it seems that everything is running. They've already done their apprenticeship, and it seems that everything is running smoothly. They're getting late in life. And this is when this new danger appears. And is that who is now going to call you on your blind spots?
And that's where the other pitfalls get even more, say, larger, more likely for a facilitator to fall into it: sex, money, power, etc. Because these are the time. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you cannot discern anymore. So what happens then is that basically your shadow that you cannot see begins to manifest itself as intuition. And you begin to feel that you have now this very fine sort of intuitive power, this ability very quickly to sort of see and decide and make decisions and make calls because you're very experienced, you're very confident, and you're now moving without. But there is whatever aspect of yourself it is that is still unworked will manifest itself as part of this.
I think if people want to hear more about these pitfalls in this particular issue, I would, of course, refer them over to the course. If they're still not certain about the course, we do have our most previous episode where we went more deeply into that. So I'm going to leave it there for people to explore either our previous interview or the course if they want to hear more on that. I want to finish up with suggestibility before I go into a particular phrasing and how it kind of relates to this "it depends" hygiene balance thing that you're talking about. Although the last point I think is pretty clear. It's like maybe the most sort of fundamental, and you may want to go into it more, you may not, but it's ultimately, quote, and speaking from the perspective of a facilitator, if we ignore suggestibility in how we conduct ourselves with our clients that is a potential way in which we can harm our clients. If we just simply ignore it, we could leave it there if you want to comment on it. You can, though.
I would just say that all of this happens because facilitators or participants are not meeting in what you call, an equality of conditions. They're not equals. I mean, these things, the giving advice, the telling people, this happens among friends, it happens among family members, it happens, at work, it happens, it's part of life. But the circumstances are different there in the sense that, your neighbor told you that they think that you are such and such way, or that such and such thing happens to you. And because you're in a certain, equilibrium of conditions, you can dismiss what this person says or not, or you can think about it, or you can, and that's, again, this is life and this is fine. But what happens is that when a person is administering psychedelics to somebody else, there is an inequality of power, there is an inequality of conditions, and you have now a person who is very open, who's become basically a patient, who is going to go into transference with the guide. And there, the words and the actions of the guide will have much, much larger impact than a normal person in similar circumstances in any other context. And this is the part that is sort of, key to understand, because again, all of this is the business of everyday life, people having problems, people trying to make decisions, people asking for advice, people consulting others, you giving opinions, you giving and there's certain things about people that are very easy to see. You can look at a total stranger and very quickly, see like this person is blah, 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 and they should probably do this, right? But when this relationship is unequal, then one has to be more careful.
So again, I think what I'm about to ask is going to sort of like bring it a bit of repetition to what you've been speaking to throughout the course of the interview here. But it also has to do with a phrasing. So the list of points that I just brought from the course, in the course, they're presented as, we as in guides, quote, the ways in which we might accidentally harm our clients through a lack of care. I want to ask you what that means, especially when it comes to lack of care. I mean, harm is clear. We just discussed that so far. But what do you mean by lack of care? Because I assume most of the things that you've listed here, outside of it being particularly, egregious, perhaps, although the people offering it, might have been quite a lot of care there. I could have been deeply caring for a person if I'm the facilitator. I'm caring for their experience. I'm caring for their confusion. There's a lot of care there in me offering my perspective, my advice, my interpretation. So how is it that these things can amount to a lack of care if the subjective experience of the facilitator is that of caring for or having the best intentions to care for their client or participant?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it goes back to the thing. It's a lack of care because the guide's job is not to know the correct perspective or interpretation, but the guide must know which ones are problematic interpretations. And that's when it becomes a lack of care, when they don't know which interpretations might be problematic. And this includes everything from taking drastic life changes on the heat of the moment to, people who receive orders of missions or tasks, and they go ahead and sort of like to, reaching conclusions about one's identity, sexual identity, personal identity, psychological identity during ceremony, going to places that are full of guilt or paranoia or jealousy, predictions of the future. These are just sort of a list of things that can be problematic, and that interpretation is key. So the guide doesn't need to know which is the right interpretation, but they should know which ones are problematic. Because people don't have problems when they have a vision and say, well, I'm not sure if it had this vision, it means this or that. Problems come when people are convinced of something Aya told them, from divorcing to changing jobs to whatever. We had a recent case we had a recent case where a person drank ayahuasca, and ayahuasca told this other person is going to die, and then this person died. So then the person who drank ayahuasca became, very sort of certain of ayahuasca's authority, and then they drank ayahuasca again, and ayahuasca told them during this certain time that they should undergo this surgical procedure that the person had been wondering whether to undergo or not, a certain surgical procedure. They drank ayahuasca, and ayahuasca said, yes, go through the surgery. Don't worry about anything. It's going to be absolutely fine. Then the person underwent the procedure, and the procedure had all of these complications. And the person had sort of complications stretching for months, even years. And then the person felt into this total sort of disarray and confusion about whether they could trust ayahuasca or not, and they made the right decision or not. Or they, this is sort of like an example without, the facilitator is not part of this. Yeah? But what would have been the role of the facilitator on this? I say, well, first of all, to tell the person that, again, that a surgery is a strong decision. That is great that they got this message from ayahuasca, but that they should be sure about it, because sometimes, not just sometimes, but sometimes very often, ayahuasca says one thing, or one thing appears during the ceremony, and then it turns out to go in a very different direction. I can give you countless examples of these, But I will just give, perhaps one tip that will be useful for everybody. Then this is an example that came from, a very experienced facilitator who I know, who's also a psychoanalyst, who's been a meditator. This person has done all the personal work imaginable, plus with plants. And they were going to sort of a personally complex a situation having to do with, a lawsuit and lawyers and, an inheritance and, a number of things that were being set up. And she had set up this sort of, solution to it. And then she drank ayahuasca, and ayahuasca told her, this solution that you picked, this is never going to work, and it's going to be a disaster, and you're going to lose all your money. And she's like, what are you talking about? I thought about this so well. We look at this thing, we really talked with different lawyers. We're pretty sure we're doing that. Are you sure? I'm telling you, it's never going to work. You're going to lose all your money. And then she was like, but are you sure? I'm telling you, this is ayahuasca. This is going to be. And this went on all night. She went in a terrible struggle, because this was a huge decision with like very, very big implications, And she was about to do what ayahuasca told her, because it was coming so strong that night. This message was coming so strong. And then she was wise enough to ask the right question, which was, whose voice is this speaking right now? Whose voice is it that is speaking right now? And then she realized it was the voice of her mother, who had always been critical, always telling her this is always. And then she went and she did the opposite of what ayahuasca told her, and it worked. And indeed, it went as she has planned, right? So again, the ability, and this would be part of the job of a skill facilitator, the ability to help people see, either direct them to somebody else or help them see, whose voice is this? Are you sure? I mean, are you going to, you've really thought about this, you looked at it very well, and now you're going to change the mind on the flip second because of something that happened during an ayahuasca ceremony. There's other ways to check, but to go back to and we spoke about it in the previous interview of how you can confirm, what are ways to confirm what ayahuasca tells you and discern. But I think this is where the lack of care comes. The lack of care comes in misunderstanding, what the sort of the duty of the facilitator is.
And so, theoretically, the lack of care isn't that the facilitator isn't caring on a subjective, personal felt perspective. Yeah. It's that, if we go back to your, surgery metaphor, as a surgeon, I could deeply care for my, patient on the table, but I'm still showing a lack of care if I don't wash my hands.
Exactly. It's lots of caring and lack of care. And these two things can happen at the same time. Unfortunately, they happen often at the same time.
And a big part of that, I assume, is a lack of sort of, support, education, skillfulness, awareness, etc. But is this sort of discernment. I want to ask you, again, this is probably something that it's going to be a bit repetitive, but these two questions are direct. One will be about as a facilitator and one will be about as a participant. And the first one is, as a facilitator, as a guide, how do we tell the difference between helpful and harmful interpretations or perspectives? How do we learn about ourselves and about, what is, these harmful? You said that you don't need to know the positive ones, you just need to avoid the negative ones. Like, how do we come to learn that? How does a facilitator come to learn that in their practice, and how it might play out in the way they conduct themselves as facilitators?
I think this is very new for us. I go back to the X-rays examples, and we're a little bit at that stage, sort of a cultural stage. I think with psychedelics, where we're just putting the X-rays on everything and all the time, and we're only going to, with time, develop much safer practices around this. But this issue that I'm talking about is sort of like neutral to psychology. People who study psychotherapy, psychology, psychoanalysis are deeply aware of this. They are the first sort of people in our culture that run head on into this topic, which is like how often when you try to help people, especially by talking to them, about their problems and stuff, you end up doing more harm than good. And this is the reason. If you haven't done the proper training and the proper work, if you don't understand active listening, if you don't understand projection, if you don't understand transference and counter-transference, if you're not even, and by understanding, I don't mean knowing what they are in theory, but having undergone the personal process where you're able to identify these things in yourself, where somebody asks you enough questions that you yourself suddenly catch yourself in what you're doing, right? This is more or less, very roughly speaking, the sort of the idea of these processes. It's not that somebody else is going to tell you, I noticed this and this and this and this about you, but it's somebody helping you notice this in yourself by asking you enough questions the right way until this thing comes to you, right? Until this sort of insight comes. So I think guides should be very, very honest about what they don't know. This is the most, and it's hard to know what you don't know because you don't know that you don't know it. But they should be very honest about this to themselves and to the participants. And there is a way to accompany people without directing them. There is a way to help people be autonomous and adult. And it's difficult to do it when people tend to put you in the opposite position. People want you to be a guide. People want you to be a father figure. People want you to be all knowing. People want you to be, revested of spiritual authority. And they are going to do this to you. They're going to do this to the plants. This is also the other half of this equation, right? People will fall into this. And I myself am falling into this, all of us. And it's part of, there is no other way to learn except to sort of go through this. I don't think, I'm hoping the really big mistakes can be avoided, but I think the medium to small mistakes are unavoidable, and this is how we learn. So this is not about creating a perfect sort of situation where no one ever is wrong, and because there's also no growth and no learning there. But there is the bigger, more dangerous interpretations, the biggest mistakes can be sort of avoided with the level of, and then there is a sort of, I work with David. He also teaches in the course. He's a psychologist. He has one of his teachers, I can't remember the name, is an Italian psychologist. But he said something that I found really interesting. And he said, basically, he said two things. One was that any sort of tool that you give people and that have not done the personal work will immediately get turned into a weapon of the ego. So, everything is, and it also happens with the spiritual truths. The world is perfect like it is. This is a spiritual truth to be reached after meditating for 40 years. If you haven't done this spiritual work, the world is perfect as it is. We'll get used to justify abuses, misbehavior, everything else. So this is an example. One is how tools, insights without the work become weapons.
It reminds me of the phrase, the right thing said at the wrong time is the wrong thing said.
And then the other thing that he said is that the minute one stops being a student, and one stops being a patient, that's when the danger begins. So the other recommendation, I think, for guides is that the minute, one should always have a doctor and a therapist, a supervisor, and there should always be somebody else that you go to for this. Because when you become alone and you don't have this, then the danger begins.
Okay, hold on. Short moment of orientation, I began thinking about something totally different, just like came in, hit me with like a freight train, totally knocked me off the track. Let me see if I can get back on here. So I know for a fact there are some people who listen to my show who are facilitators, and I can imagine there are many, many more than I know, and even many more than that who want to be facilitators, are training to be facilitators in traditional, or learning through traditional contexts, or going the path of psychotherapy, schooling here in the Western world, psychedelic psychotherapy. But I assume quite a small portion of my listeners relative to the people who are participants. They're the people who are putting themselves, like subjecting themselves to that disbalance of power in the hope and in the trust that their facilitator will have good hygiene and an abundance of care for their experiences. My personal experience is that the majority of the facilitators that I have sort of interacted with, at least early on, did not have a lot of this knowledge. And I can look back in some of my most troubling experiences, especially having taken the AyaSafety course, and seen how the things that you're talking about, these sort of significant things that we can avoid, happening if we have the right amount of like education about them, strategizing plans and, in advance, so on and so forth. Like they happened because those things were lacking, because the facilitators were falling into, all of these different places that could have absolutely been avoided. My assumption, even as somebody, who helps people Like they contact me, I had this experience and need some help integrating it. The stories I hear of the kind of facilitation that is underway around me sometimes is very jarring and depressing, even at times, if not, at the least concerning. I imagine yourself, working at iSeers, this to also be the case. If this wasn't the case, there would be absolutely no reason for an AyaSafety course to exist, right? Mm-hmm. So all that being said, the people who are listening who are not facilitators, but will be looking to be facilitated, is there any, can you offer some advice? Oh, are you? It depends. But specifically, like, is there any way in which we as participants can kind of like navigate the potential things that might come up such that we can, still leave the optimized space of openness, that allows for positive things to come, while sort of mitigating and being careful with what might end up being a lack of care from our facilitators with respect to suggestibility, perspectives, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of work trying to sort of create better training for facilitators, and eventually sort of our hope and our vision in iSeers is that eventually this will be a respected profession like any others, and it will be part of our society for those people who are interested in participating in these things. We're not there yet. And instead, what we have is a sort of Wild West where everything sort of coexists. Absolutely brilliant people, committed, care, full of care and knowledge, and some not so well prepared people. I always remember, I have a friend whose mother was a nurse and she worked in the emergency room. And because she worked in the emergency room, she saw all the car accidents that teenagers got into. In Spain, it's motorbikes. Teenagers have motorbikes. She saw every weekend all the motorbike accidents. So she was terrified of, her daughter ever touching a motorbike. In a way, she had a point. In another way, her vision was distorted because she worked in the emergency room. She saw all the accidents. This was all the accidents in the area, right? I felt lucky that my mother didn't work in the emergency room, so she let me have a motorbike and I didn't get in an accident, right? So I keep this in mind because, like you, I receive a lot of the, and in iSeers we receive a lot of the accidents, so we get to see this, and this can also, in a way, sort of, bias your perspective of what's happening, and I try to keep this also to keep my optimism. But
sure, I don't get a lot of messages from people saying like, hey, everything went extremely well and I got all the support I needed, and so I'm messaging you for extra. Like, that's sometimes, but for the most part, that's not why people are reaching out.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese say, everybody hears the tree that falls in the forest and nobody hears the other 10,000 trees that continue to grow quietly, right? This is sort of, yes, this is like this. The other thing is that also, a huge part of this will go away if people, participants, were more knowledgeable and better educated. If there was more education in the demand side instead of on the offer side of psychedelics, I think a lot of these issues could be avoided if people had better tools. But this is, again, very new, and nobody knows, what a good facilitator should look like, or how you tell. You have some ways to tell if you like your plumber, your electrician, your dentist. But really, when it comes to, facilitating psychedelics, are they supposed to look weird with tattoos, have piercings? Not. Are they supposed to, sort of anything goes. It's the Wild West. But there's some basic tips that, that people can always and should always keep in mind. First of all, one of them has to do about, having some distrust around what looks like very rigid contexts. If the context seems very rigid to you, if the person that you're dealing seems very rigid to me, this doesn't have to be a problem, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. It's something to observe. You should never drink with people that you don't trust, because if things get difficult, then you're really going to need to trust the person who's going to take care of you. So if you meet a facilitator and there's something that just doesn't feel right, don't do it. Keep looking. It's okay. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're, completely open, fully vulnerable, and you don't trust the person who's supposed to take care of you. A big part of this process working also has to do with the participant trust in the facilitator. So if the trust is not there, that's a no-no. You shouldn't, trust people who don't seem to care for you very much. So people, they either care about your money or about your sign up or about, if the person doesn't seem to, that's also something to take into consideration, because this is the person who's supposed to take care of you. And you should know that this is going to increase your suggestibility. You should know that if you keep drinking with this person, at some point or another, you're going to find this person either attractive or supernaturally wise or just, all around incredible, and you should know that this is coming, so that when it comes, you recognize it for what it is. You should know that you should try to not take life-changing decisions on a rush. It's okay. You can, if it's important, it will be important today and 1 month from now. If it's important, it really deserves that you give it all your time and all your thought about how you're going to do all of these moving pieces. If you're going to make a big life change, take your time, and always, think about whether this process is developing your personal autonomy and your critical discernment, or it's quite the opposite. You find yourself becoming more and more dependent on this person. And again, part of the therapeutic alliance is that you will become dependent on someone. And it's not the dependency and the fact that you have doubts and you like to ask this question that is the problem. It's how is the shape and it takes, or how long, whether you feel that you're being brought in or you're sort of pushed back into yourself. All of these things will give you sort of clues, that can help you begin to discern. I think, I haven't, I've been drinking ayahuasca 20 years. I've basically drunk roughly with the same group of people, some changes, but they're within the same sort of satellites of the same group of people for the majority of these years. And I think that's part of the reason why I still have faith in the power of these plants, and I haven't become jaded or about the potential. There is something very beautiful and special and powerful that can happen, once the right match happens between you and the person who will take care of you in this state. But like all other important matches and relationships in life, like romantic engagements, like friendships, like many other things, it might take a few trials. You might be disappointed with a few people, and then you might eventually come to the place where you, as a sort of mature adult, know what's good for you and who's the company that you want to keep. I would say, something that close with this, something that a friend said to me in my birthday, and he was quoting somebody else. He said, "It's not the company that you keep, but the company that keeps you."
Your comment there about, going back to the very beginning of like, we here in the sort of Western world, global North, the institutionalization of psychedelics from a facilitation standpoint is very new. And on the facilitation end and on the participant end, like you said, wild, wild west, we don't really know what's best yet or how to assess that, what's best or what's worse. I mean, what's worse is getting more and more clear. What's best is still sort of emerging, thankfully. I like to hope that, I like to intend at least, that the conversations I feature here on the show help sort of elevate people's understandings of what's possible with their own experience, but also what is reasonable for them to expect from their facilitators. both in the sense of like, I expect this should be offered, and I expect that this should not be offered. And I deeply appreciate, Jerónimo, your work and you helping to elevate that as well, and giving your time onto us today to help with that elevation outwards into our sort of budding psychedelic world here in the West/global North. And, on the facilitator side of things for courses like AyaSafe. And so in closing, can you give us another quick sort of info packet about the AyaSafe course and when it starts and how people can get more information?
Yeah, I mean, if you found this conversation interesting or very interesting, well, we have a full course full of much more than this, but it's these topics and much, much more. We also touch things like medical interactions and the legal issues, dangers for participants, dangers for guides, psychology for non-psychologists, as you said, and there's also a module for Mark Ashala about everything that we learned running an emergency room for 10 years, which is the ICR Support Center, and what we see. So it's a 6-month course. We are an NGO. We're not a business. We're a nonprofit, so we try to keep it very accessible. It's not expensive at all for the number of hours that it has. It's in English. It's both in English and Spanish. There's 2 versions of it. There's different price options depending on your country and residence, because we want to keep prices fair. There's also the possibility of scholarship. So, we really try to make it so that money is not a barrier in accessing this information. This information that I share, that is not mine. I don't know if you notice, but in case, people didn't, all I've done is repeat things that other people had told me, and that I found, useful, wise, important, relevant. First of all, to my own experience, because I also went through all of these things. I've gone through all of these things myself. All of these we've poured into this course that we feel offers something that you cannot find in other courses. It's not enough in itself to prepare anybody to facilitate, but it is a great complement for people who are facilitating. That's how the course, or they're around sort of organizing. One of the most sort of things that we have heard in terms of reviews that made me feel the best was, I had a number of knowledgeable and very knowledgeable facilitators who participated, and when it was done, they told me, look, when I saw this, I thought, I'm beyond this, I'm not going to learn anything new or anything interesting. And they were surprised to see how many new things they learn. And then the other thing that for me was really that was a sort of like, we've had also a small number of people participate in the course who have told us, after taking the course, I realized that this is not for me, and I'm going to stop facilitating. I think that's a sort of that to me shows that people understand something that I think is just deeply important here, and it's just how delicate this is, and to which degree it can really influence people for better and for worse. How high the demands are that come associated with this profession is not at all it's not at all fancy. It's very, very difficult work that goes on for very long, that sometimes is full of appreciation and sometimes is full of strife, but that many of the biggest harms can be avoided simply with good, with awareness and education. So the course runs every year. It runs for 6 months. It starts in May, and applications are now open, and they will be open until the end of April. And to go there, you just go. The website is ayasafety.school. You just type that into your browser and you will get there, and we will also have some links for you. Also, I want to thank you very much, James, for having us. It's without spaces like these, our work, part of the problem with this work is precisely the fact that it's atomized and it's small and it's not pollinated and it's not evenly distributed. So, the work of, podcasters and other people such as yourself is also very, very important to sort of be, to spread these ideas and to sort of collectively, sort of create a cushion of common sense around, a set of experiences that are not always, so driven by this.
Well, thank you for saying so, Jerónimo. It's I appreciate that, and I also appreciate again your time here today. For the listeners, I'll be sure that there's a link to you said AyaSafety, AYASafety.school.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. That's all you have to type. Yeah,
and I look forward to talking again maybe one day if we get you on for another podcast in the future. But we'll call this one a close. Thanks again, Jerónimo. Really appreciate it.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, James.
And cut. Okay, that was episode 195 of Adventures Through the Mind with Jerónimo Mazarrasa. Definitely go take a look at the course. AyaSafety is just personally, like I said in the intro and throughout the course of the interview, I really genuinely believe it's an incredibly valuable course. So links to check it out are in the description to this episode. And as we mentioned in the intro, if you use the promo code AYATTM, AyaTTM, Ayahuasca Adventures Through the Mind, you'll get 15% off the price of the course, and that'll be added on top of the 10% early bird discount if you sign up before March 23rd. So that's 25% off before March 23rd and 15% off afterwards if you use the promo code AyaTTM. Links to the course will be in the description to this episode, and it starts May 9th. Registration closes a few days before that, so make sure you head over there and at least take a look before you lose the opportunity to be a part of the 2025 cohort. If you're enjoying the show generally and you'd like to stay up to date and sort of like on board with new content that I'm producing, podcast and otherwise, of course, you can subscribe to this show, be it on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube, where I release these interviews and videos. You can also follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram at ATTMind, Adventures Through the Mind, @Mind podcast. So ATTMind podcast on Instagram. I'm also on Blue Sky, jameswjesso.bsky.social, and I'm on other platforms too, but I just not really liking the direction they're going, not necessarily politically. I just mean from an algorithmic perspective, I don't think they're doing well. So I'm mostly sticking around on Blue Sky these days and then using Instagram as a place to share clips and stuff from the shows. So follow me in those two places. If you'd like to be a little bit more directly connected with me, you can do so by signing up for my email newsletter. A link to that is in the description. I also have just started a Substack. You can follow me there at James W. Jesso. I haven't released anything yet, but you could be one of the first people to see the first thing that I release whenever that happens. So if you're a Substack person, consider me there. And there's also a Telegram group. So a lot of options for you. Instagram, Blue Sky, Substack, email, Telegram. Links to all of that are in the description to this episode. And, pick your fancy. And here we are. We're at the end of the episode 195, and I thank you for your time and attention and for sticking around all the way to the end. I have been your host, James W. Jesso, and until the next episode, take care and stay curious.